Oh boy, here we go. Okay, so this gentleman says oil was over $100 a barrel and gas was $2.50 a gallon a few years ago. And I responded to this comment and I said, that's not a thing that happened. That didn't happen. And he responded back and said, the fuck it didn't. Look at 2007, 2008. First of all, I don't need to look at 2007 and 2008. I did go back and look at it just to show you some receipts, but I don't need to look at it because just your statement is not possible on its face. You see, there's 42 gallons of oil in a barrel of oil. And so if oil was $100 and gas was $2.50 and 50 cents of that was state and federal taxes, that means the wholesale price of gas would have been $2. And if they were selling gas at what would be $2 before taxes, and selling 42 gallons of gas, they would be making $84. And if oil would have been $100, that means they would have been losing $16 a barrel on every single barrel of oil they refined into gasoline. And a lot of these refineries, process hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil a day. So you're telling me that these refiners were losing upwards of $2 million a day just to give you low gas prices. And that's how I know this is not a thing. But I went ahead and went back and looked at 2007, 2008 to show you some receipts. So these are some oil prices from 2007. You said oil was $100 a barrel and gas was $2.50. So this is 2007. And this is all, $50 to $60 a barrel. This is through basically the first and second quarter of 2007. So for the first half of the year, oil prices during 2007 was $50 to $60 a barrel. And then in the third and fourth quarters of 2007, oil started to rise. And we see it got into the 70s, and it was in the 70s, then it got into the 80s, it got into the 90s. What you don't see here is any hundreds. Oil didn't hit $100 a barrel on the WTI in 2007. Now this part is where gas prices started to rise. Now the average price of gas in 2007 worked out to $2.85 a gallon, which is $4.05 adjusted for inflation. Now for the first half of 2007, gas prices were definitely in the $2.30 to $2.50 range when oil was 50 and 60 bucks. But in the later part of 2007, when oil got into the 70s, 80s, and eventually 90s, gas prices went well over $3 a gallon. And when you average out the whole year, that's how you got your average up to $2.85. But gas was never $2.50 in the second part of the year when oil was in the 80s and 90s. That's not a thing. Now, since we're on this screen, in 2008, gasoline averaged $3.32 a gallon. Now, for a lot of 2008, oil was well over $100 a barrel. When we got to, the fourth quarter, though, of 2008, oil prices started crashing. And by the time we got to the end of the year, oil was $30 a barrel. Now, if we look at 2008, we can see that gasoline prices were well over $3 a gallon and over $4 a gallon in many instances. This is during the period of those high oil prices. And at the end of the year, when oil got down to $30 a barrel, gas was $1.65. And keep in mind, that's with taxes. So this 332 average in 2008 is not representative of most of the year. It was actually much higher than this most of the year. It was over $4 a gallon for some of the months. But when you have a couple of months in a year where your gas falls well below $2, even down to $1.65 for a whole month, that brings this average way down. If not for those last couple of months of the year, the average price of gasoline probably would have been 30 or 40 cents higher for the year. So when I say that didn't happen, there was never a time when oil was $100 and gas was $2.50. It's because it didn't happen. You are remembering the highest prices of oil during an entire year, and you are connecting that to the lowest prices of gas during a time of year during over 15 years ago. That's what you're doing here. Gas was not $2.50 when oil was $100. And people do this all the time, almost on a daily basis. And You must not know who I am, because every time this happens, I have to explain it again. This is not hard. It's very simple. You don't even have to go look it up. You can just do a little bit of math in your head and know that oil wasn't 100 when gas was 250. Companies don't go through the process, very expensive process of extracting oil, transporting it to refineries, processing that into feedstocks and gasoline and fuels, and then transporting that to retailers, and then having retailers have their markup on it and have taxes have their mark, and the whole supply chain process that cost, hundreds of millions of dollars. Companies don't go through all that to lose $16 a barrel. And I'm going to tie this in to why we lost so many refineries between 2016 and 2020. What I'm explaining to you right here is exactly why we lost those refineries. And that is because the prior administration used foreign adversaries, foreign governments, to flood the world with oil in order to keep oil prices down and keep gas prices down. And while that's great for the consumer for a short period of time, ultimately what happens is when you artificially depress prices for corporations, they eventually just go out of business. And that's why we lost these refineries, and that's why we're paying more for gas now, because we were so worried about cheap gas a few years ago. We literally put a portion of our refining sector completely out of business because we were addicted to cheap gas, and now we're bitching that we have to pay for that. And we are going to continue to pay for that. We live in a capitalist society, a capitalist economy, and what that means is the corporations and businesses that operate in this country, they do it for a profit, and they have to make money. That's how they pay their people, which are the people that live in this country, by the way. The everyday blue-collar worker. If the companies can't make a profit, they can't pay their employees, they can't stay in business. If they can't stay in business, then we lose that product. When we lose that product in those companies, then that product becomes a lot more scarce, and that, scarcity causes those prices to go up. And that's what we're paying for right now. Right now, we're paying for our addiction to cheap gas that we had 4, 5, 6 years ago. And since people in this country believe they are entitled to $2 gas or $2.50 gas because they're Americans and they deserve it, they got that for a little while. And Donald Trump gave that to them for a little while. And in the process of him giving them all that, he also gave them what they're paying for gas today. And I'm not even going to get into the fact that if people in this country actually earned a good livable wage, they wouldn't be so obsessed with what they pay for gasoline. It's like the concept was, let's make everything cheaper so people can afford it instead of paying people more money so they can afford it. The problem with making everything cheaper so they can afford it is that you lose all of your companies that make that product, and you lose that competition to foreign companies who use cheap labor and cheap products to make those products. That's why we're so dependent on China now. We lost a lot of our manufacturing base in this country because we wanted shit cheap. We wanted shit cheap because we weren't paid well enough. And so U.S. manufacturing couldn't make that stuff cheap enough. They eventually went out of business. And now China's slave labor is providing us with cheap TVs and cheap refrigerators and cheap washers and dryers, which is great until you consider the fact that when you destroy your manufacturing base by making everything cheap instead of paying people a livable wage, what you ultimately do is destroy those middle-class people that needed a livable wage so they could build the products we use every day. And now we've completely destroyed our manufacturing base. We've completely destroyed our middle class. But hey, you got a TV for $250. So instead of looking at it from the mindset of I deserve cheap products and services, look at it from the mindset of I deserve to earn a livable wage that allows me to afford the products and services that I want to purchase in this country, made by my fellow Americans that work in this country. That's how you look at it. Quit thinking cheap and start thinking pay me enough I can, survive. That's how you got to look at it. It's not about cheap. It's about getting paid. All right, I'm done.